Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. Coming up on the programme this week.
I didn't realise men could get eating disorders. Eating disorders are always talked about as a female illness.
In the next sort of 5 years, we'll start to see the true picture, and also that the pressures for people are changing. And I think we will be seeing people, coming through to our service and through to the NHS services.
We talk about female bodies all the time and female experiences of eating disorders. And so it does alienate you and ostracize you, and it makes you feel even kind of less deserving of treatment.
And I'll be reminding you how you can make connections with mental health organisations within your community. It's Mental Health Monday. Yeah, welcome to the home of the UK's conversation about mental health. It's Mental Health Monday. Some cracking episodes we've had in recent weeks and some really positive responses on social media. Thanks as well to Simon Gunning and the Calm team. We did a little pop-up on what was Blue Monday last week as a little bit of a lunchtime chat. We did that as a video chat actually on YouTube. Went out on midday on Blue Monday. This slightly silly, the most depressing day of the year idea, which we kind of kibosh and shoot down straight away has been a bit of a nonsense. But you know what? I saw loads of people talking about it and tweeting about it and saying things about it. And actually a good starting point for a conversation about mental health. Doesn't matter if it's been made up or not. I don't see any reason why any day can't be a day to have a conversation about mental health. Thank you for your support as well for our Rambler Man podcast as well. Ewan and the guys behind that. Fingers crossed we can get some release dates and details for that one to you over the course of the next few weeks. We're going to pick up on a story now which we sort of touched on at the back end of last year in one of the podcasts actually. It was about the rise in eating disorders being reported during the lockdown period, and particularly a rise in males, boys, men, adolescents reporting eating disorders as well. So I did a little bit of digging on this one, working alongside Beat, the UK's eating disorder charity. Fantastic organisation, and as you'll hear, a bit of signposting to them as part of the conversation this week to find out whether or not they had in fact seen an increase in men and adolescent men coming to them to talk about their mental health. Yes is the answer. In fact, they have seen a 113% increase in men using their sessions. Between April 2019 and March 2020, just before the pandemic, they had just under 4,700 sessions attended by men. Between April 2020 and March 2021, so that first year of the pandemic, nearly 10,000 sessions attended by men. So quite clearly a huge increase, 113%. Now overall, there's about 1.25 million people that we know have got an eating disorder, or that we can guess have an eating disorder within the UK. Around 25% of them are male. But as we'll hear in the conversation that we're about to have with Ed Emond, Beat's Deputy Director of Services, and Thomas Pickford, who himself has lived with anorexia and was diagnosed with an eating disorder around about 5 years ago at the age of 21. We will talk through the fact that actually there is a great deal of stigma and misunderstanding around male eating disorders, and actually it could be significantly higher than that 25% figure that I quoted before. So thanks to the Beat team for pulling this one together and for their stats. Thank you for Thomas for sharing his story. You'll hear from him shortly. First, Ed starts off by talking about the situation as he finds it and the fact that, yeah, it could be a much different story if we had a full understanding of what was really going on out there.
Yeah, so it's definitely something that is a big issue for all the many people that we support across Beat, that people don't understand fully what it's like to have an eating disorder. We are seeing progress in that, and I think particularly the conversations in the last 5 years or so have improved in that regard, but particularly when it comes to men, it's still very much people don't see it as something that a man can struggle with, and it's often dismissed as something else, or kind of how it presents might be a bit different, and so often it gets missed. So we think that 1 in 5 figure is probably an underrepresentation of what's really out there and what's going on at the moment.
What are those sort of presentations that a man might make that might not be spotted in the way that somebody might spot something that might be experienced by somebody else?
So I think there's obviously a lot of common symptoms, but I think particularly with men, perhaps the relationship with exercise, may be seen as something that's more hidden in terms of obsessive exercise, and how that kind of plays into masculinity. and also when it comes to diets and kind of how people eat, whether that's restrictive eating or binge eating. Again, particularly on the binge eating side, is an area that people don't really associate with an eating disorder. So that can be particularly difficult if you're struggling with your relationship with food, that kind of people just don't understand that's to do with their mental health rather than to do with kind of physical health, perhaps.
Yeah, and we'll come on to talk about sort of diagnosis and sitting in a room with a GP for one. But I wanted to take a look at sort of, for men, maybe men who are listening to this, who are having experiences which they don't understand to be eating disorders. And I wonder if that's one of the biggest leaps that we've got to make in this particular field, that we've almost got to be able to tell men what an eating disorder is or how it might present itself in them. And as you've already suggested, that's very different to what they might expect.
Yeah, so awareness is a really big part. So we know that the biggest barrier to people receiving treatment is recognizing that there is a problem in itself. And so it tends to take people about 3 years to access treatment from the point of symptoms starting. And particularly in men, as you say, if people don't recognize that this could be something that they're experiencing, then it's going to be much harder to break that cycle. And particularly the first stage of often with an eating disorder is that denial and that non-acceptance of the issue. But it's why it's really important that we're seeing more men, particularly in the public eye, coming forward and talking about their experiences. So like Andrew Flintoff in the last couple of years is really lifting the lid on what it can be like to experience an eating disorder as a man, and for people to see themselves in those people is really, really important.
Are there sort of red flags or things that not just the men but people around the men need to be aware of that might suggest that there might be an eating disorder in play?
So I think the early signs that we tend to see are it's mainly a change in behaviour, which often particularly around meal times. So change in mood, people being perhaps more anxious or potentially more volatile, and so that can be quite a change, and tend to be more secretive around meal times and food. So it might be saying, I've already eaten earlier, or I'll eat something later. Some of those avoidance techniques that can happen. And so it tends to be those are the subtle changes that we see. And so I think, generally speaking, whether across the whole spectrum of mental health, it's really important if you're noticing those changes in people, it's having those conversations early and also keeping an eye and revisiting. So it's quite normal for somebody to say, actually, no, there's no problem at all, and to shut that conversation down. But the fact that you've started that conversation, you've planted that seed, and then coming back to it later, if you're seeing those changes persist, then that can be often a really good way of starting that. And so I guess it's not avoiding the conversations because it might feel difficult or you're worried about what it might might make things worse, which is very rare that having those honest conversations will have a more negative effect.
I think that's a great advice. I think as well, because I think as a layman, you would expect to almost spot that sort of physical change in somebody, or so how would you spot someone with an eating disorder? You would presume it would be something that you would see or something that you would look at, or a physiological sort of change as well. But actually, what you've talked about there is behavioural sort of changes as well. I guess that can be the same for both men and women, but it's sometimes a little bit more difficult with men because physically men can be sort of all different sort of shapes and sizes, if you like.
Yeah, and I think again, people that are struggling with their weight, whether it's being overweight or underweight, can be very good at hiding that. There's different ways in which people can do that. And if there is a problem, then the illness is working to hide it from those that are closest to them. And again, I think it comes, as you say, it comes down to perceptions of what a man is, and as you say, the different body shapes that may be celebrated or seen as normal. But then an eating disorder is much more than the physical side of things. It is how someone's relationship is with food and their relationship with their body and how they're feeling. So the vast majority of people with an eating disorder aren't actually underweight, but then actually in how it's represented in the media, which tends to be the way that people first come across eating disorders is that it's more than often than not people are seeing experiences of anorexia, and often at the more extreme ends of that illness.
Absolutely. A word that often comes up when I have conversations on Mental Health Monday around eating disorders is control. Because I think when people talk about weight or body shape, that it comes with this idea that eating disorders is an obsession with a physical state, that people who want to look potentially a certain way. But this word control always comes up, which I think, if people can understand what this control aspect of it is, I think it gives people a greater understanding around an eating disorder and how those sort of symptoms and signposts might play out. Could I get your sort of explanation of, or how you view that sort of word control within the conversation around eating disorders?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're right. Control is definitely a really good word to describe what's going on. And I think with people that are having a difficult time, it's often a way of coping with really intense feelings or different experiences that may be out of their control. And so people having an outlet where they do have control over, what they're eating, whether that's overeating or restrictive eating, that can be something that allows somebody to feel that sense of control. Now, obviously, perversely, what's actually happening is it's the illness that's having the control over them, and making big changes to their lives that is very hard to recover from. But in terms of how the brain and the body is coping with those experiences, that can be something that gives that feeling of comfort. But the really important thing for anybody listening is to recognize that recovery and a full recovery is really possible, and that the sooner somebody gets help, the outcomes are significantly better. So don't delay in reaching out for support if you think that you might be struggling, and there is help out there for those that need it.
Absolutely. In a couple of moments, we'll speak to Thomas, who's experience of living with an eating disorder. But can I ask you, in terms of that conversation around the stigma and understanding, or the stigma and lack of understanding, when we talk about the 25% are men, people living with eating disorders, where might that number be in terms of the realities, both in terms of men who might then learn to understand that they have an eating disorder, and also men who then might come forward and get an eating disorder? Are we closer to a 1 in 3 potentially, do you think? Could we, I'm not saying it might be 50-50, but do you think that statistically we could actually in reality have a very different sort of picture than that sort of 25% of 1.25 million?
Yeah, I think it's quite tricky because the research is quite limited at the moment, and so those numbers are based on who has presented to the system. I think we know anecdotally that men do take longer to recognise as an issue, regardless of what the health condition is. So yeah, we'd be fairly confident in saying that 20% is the lowest end of the estimate. And it could be, as you say, much closer to 1 in 3. It could be much closer to parity. I think the next sort of 5 years we'll start to see, as awareness increases, we'll start to see the true picture, and also that the pressures for people are changing and are obviously with the pandemic as well. I think we will be seeing people coming through to our service and through to the NHS services in the next few years. Will be there'll be more men that will be reaching out.
Okay, well, I tell you what, Ed, let's bring Thomas into the conversation now, if we can. Thomas, thank you for your time now. Thomas, in his mid-20s now, diagnosed with an eating disorder at the age of 21. Thomas, thank you for your time. Thank you for speaking to us. I really appreciate it. Can I ask, when we talked before about diagnosis and knowing the signs, did you know at the age of 21, around the time of diagnosis, did you know it was an eating disorder?
Not at all, Mick. It was one of the hardest things about kind of trying to receive treatment was accepting the fact that I had an eating disorder. I think it took me a lot longer to ask for treatment than it could have, just because I just didn't recognize the signs and symptoms, mainly because I didn't realize men could get eating disorders at that point. In the media, in education, eating disorders are always talked about as a female illness, and you have the stereotype of the teenage girl who's obsessed about weight or image. And so I think the fact that stereotype was so present in my mind meant that I wasn't able to recognize those signs and symptoms and get help in the first place. Luckily, I had a really good GP who was able to diagnose when I did present to go and get help. But it made me take longer to kind of recognize that something was wrong and that there was an issue. I think it also meant that my friends around me also weren't able to approach me and say, look, is there a problem? Because they just didn't associate eating disorders with men. And I had lost weight, but a lot of people just didn't see that as an issue because it's not associated with teenage boys. And so when I did present for help, luckily I had a good GP. But I know a lot of people who have had opposite experiences where their GPs just haven't had the experience or the knowledge to say, okay, this looks like an eating disorder. And I think a lot of that does come down to gender, because it is so associated with women.
And I hope that through having conversations like this, that the people can go, all right, well, when we're talking about eating disorders, we're talking about men and women. This isn't just a gendered conversation. Actually, it was a great example there around the lack of understanding that people have, which, if you grew up in a world without the understanding, how would you have it? It just doesn't exist. But also the stigma as well, that I guess if you then turn to your friends and say, oh, guess what? I've got an eating disorder, that there would be fears around their response to it potentially, because of course that you probably grew up in similar circumstances, you probably watched the same sort of TV shows, you probably had the same preconceptions.
Absolutely, and it actually makes it even harder to accept that you have an illness and to accept that you need to do something about it to recover, because recovery is a choice at the end of the day. But those stigmas do exist, and they do create a barrier. I think a lot of it is a preconception that eating disorders are about vanity. It's all about how you look, wanting to be slim and that kind of thing, and that is not the case at all. But those preconceptions are very gendered. Men aren't supposed to care that much about how they look. Men aren't supposed to be bothered about their weight and that kind of thing. And therefore, actually talking about it with friends and families became even more difficult, because I felt in myself that I was being vain or selfish and trying to look a certain way, and I didn't want people to think like that about me, and also didn't want them to associate those gendered kind of stereotypes with me. So it did become a really hard conversation to have. Luckily, I was really supported by my family and friends, and so I was able to have those conversations finally. But it took longer than it should have, and that was a real barrier to getting down the road to recovery.
When we talk about living with an eating disorder, I mean, did you find that there were other mental health issues that you were experiencing either before, during, and after? I think sometimes people try and put a label on something, then put it into a little box somewhere. Were there other mental health experience you were having during that time?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that we don't see eating disorders as a specific kind of standalone mental illness. And also that we don't associate eating disorders just with weight and appearance, because the weight, the appearance, the eating habits, they're all symptoms of underlying issues. They're not the illness itself. And I think a lot of people don't quite understand that. I had struggled with depression and anxiety for quite a few years before I kind of started showing signs and symptoms of an eating disorder. And the eating disorder kind of emerged from those previous mental health issues. I had anxiety and depression mainly because I didn't like myself as a person, and so I going back to that word control, I tried to control everything around me so that I could feel like I was a better person, and that produced a lot of anxiety and depression. And then that anxiety kind of latched onto food and weight as a way that it could kind of try and control itself, and I could control myself. And that's when the eating habits and the weight loss emerged. So it was really kind of codependent on that kind of previous mental health issues, the anxiety and the depression. And even when the eating becomes easier, and you restore the weight, those underlying mental health issues are still there. And just because someone has put the weight back on, if it is a weight issue, as Ed was saying, the vast majority of people with an eating disorder are not underweight. But just because someone's restored their weight, or they seem to be eating what we would term as normal, it doesn't mean that they've got over those underlying mental health issues.
I think that's, again, that those preconceptions that people have. You turn to a family member and say, I've got an eating disorder. It becomes about like food and access to food and things like that. But actually, what, from your lived experience, if you just describe something completely different, it's much more about seeing the whole of a person's experience, the coping strategies that they've used for looking at other things as well. Can I ask you about something which I think this is absolutely fascinating, and it fits into very much the sort of lack of understanding, the stigma. And I don't think it's sort of malicious, but you're aware that even in like self-help books and things like that, the diagrams they used and the images they used when people talking about eating disorders, they were always female. And I just wonder what that was like, because once you get the diagnosis and you get the textbooks and you get the support, you then go, oh yeah, still none of these people look like me.
Yeah, and we talk about representation in so many different, walks of life. And when you're in treatment for something, but you don't see yourself represented, even in the self-help books, the diagrams of female bodies, all the case studies of women, and all the kind of anecdotes from girls who've recovered and this kind of thing, it becomes then really hard to kind of associate yourself with recovery, or associate yourself with the things that you need to do to get yourself better. So yeah, I'd be sat in the hospital ward, and I'd be surrounded by diagrams of female bodies, and I'd have to kind of label how I felt about my body on a female diagram and all this, and it just felt very odd, and kind of just added to this kind of dysphoria between how I was finding myself and how I felt about myself and the illness, and trying to understand it and come to terms with it, and then choose recovery. And it just felt very bizarre, really. And the whole language around eating disorders, both in public and also in health, is very gendered. We talk about female bodies all the time and female experiences of eating disorders, and so it just kind of alienate you and ostracize you, and it makes you feel even kind of less deserving of treatment, because you just don't see yourself represented in any of the help.
I wonder whether or not the obsession with the female body is, I think it probably goes back millennia in terms of like artwork and things like that. But then, of course, there's a generation, probably a generation of decision makers now who grew up in the sort of the magazine era. And I wondered now, as we moved into the social media era, in terms of how people view people's bodies or perceptions and things like that, that's a completely different landscape, if you like, that particularly younger people are in terms of they will see men and women. They'll sometimes see a man and a woman together. That it just being a female issue is less sort of reported. I guess that's good if that generation grows up seeing it as an issue for both men and women. But if the decision makers don't have an understanding of that, it does mean you end up in those slightly awkward situations like you've experienced there, where you're trying to annotate, a diagram of a female body when you want to be talking about your own.
Yeah, absolutely. I think hopefully social media kind of help in that respect. Obviously, social media has massive implications elsewhere, and it may even be behind some of the increase in the numbers behind more people coming forward with the eating disorder diagnosis. But I do hope that perhaps that movement away from very heavily female orientated magazines, and that was often where conversations around eating disorders were happening, in those female magazines. Hopefully the move away from that and to social media, and with the rise of organizations like Beat, who can raise awareness, we are able to have a more balanced conversation about eating disorders and their impacts on men and women.
Have you got thoughts, Thomas, about sort of where this conversation can take place, if you like, as a young man, given your experience, and I'm sure many people listening to this now will go, well, of course, we want to share these sorts of stories, because of course it gives people a real insight as well. And, is it a conversation for the for the pub? Is it a conversation for the football match? Is it a conversation for something else? Where can we have this conversation? Where can we engage with men, do you think, to think about these sorts of issues?
I think it absolutely can be a conversation for the pub, to be honest. You know, we need to be having these conversations everywhere we can, where people feel comfortable to do so. You know, if even if it's just a passing comment in the pub, a supportive one, which is like, oh mate, you seem to be, you know, losing a bit of weight, is everything okay? Or, oh mate, I've not seen you kind of come out for dinner for a while, is everything okay with you? Those conversations, as Ed was saying, just opens the door. And it might not be that that person engages in that conversation straight away, like right there and then, but it gives them the sense that someone's there, someone cares, and someone's noticing. And that can then give them confidence later on to then say, okay, I'm not quite right, and I would like help. I think sports clubs are a really important place to have this conversation. As Ed was saying, for a lot of men, an eating disorder will often manifest itself in excessive exercise. And also the male kind of ideal body type is quite athletic, you know, muscular. And so having these conversations in sports clubs is really important, so that coaches and also fellow players are aware of, you know, the signs and symptoms to look out for, and can be supportive when something doesn't seem right. I think another really important place to have the conversations is in gyms. Because gym culture, I think, has massively contributed to men becoming more aware of body expectations. And that has, I think, fed into an increased rise in eating disorders among men. And it's really important that gym instructors are aware of the signs and the symptoms, and also that they have conversations, you know, even in induction for gyms about eating disorders. And then schools as well, you know, we need to have these conversations in the classroom so that the young people growing up have awareness from the get-go that eating disorders are not gendered, you know, they are male and female, and also understand what the signs and symptoms are, and that they go beyond the you know, the stereotypical and the very simplified idea that it's just about weight and it's just about body image.
What I love about that answer, Thomas, is I said to you, do you think there's things that can be done? And you've got a fully formed strategy policy that we could take forward to government and go, Thomas has got it written down. Don't worry, we're going to get this boxed off. No, absolutely. What a great answer. What a great answer. Thomas, can I ask you as well, just in terms of what would you advise, or what would you say to men in particular who are experiencing those other things that we talked about, the anxiety, things like stress and depression, that you would just flag with them as if it starts moving in a slightly different direction, an eating disorder might be a conversation you need to have with a GP? What would you advise them?
I'd advise that if you start to get feelings around food or weight that are unusual, you know, you start to become obsessive about thinking about food. It's weird because I had anorexia, so I can speak from that perspective rather than another. But although we're restricting eating, we actually become obsessed about food. You know, my Instagram story, my Instagram feed was all food. And these are all signs and symptoms to look out for. If your relationship starts to change with food, you become anxious about eating, or your body weight or your image, then that's a sign that perhaps something is changing. You know, even if you have anxiety and depression in the first place, it's okay to ask for help. And it's really important that you don't see that as a weakness, because I think so many men do see having these feelings and even just mental health in general as a weakness, and it's definitely not. You know, these are chemical reactions, thought processes all going on in the brain that we can't all control all the time. So it's absolutely okay to say, okay, I'm not all right, and go and ask for help. But then if these things do start to impact on, you know, how you're eating or exercising or feeling about your body, then it's really important that you start to have a conversation with a friend, a loved one, your GP, or anyone who you feel supported by, that this could be something like an eating disorder. And that's where a service like Beat comes in brilliantly, because, you know, they have all the guides on how to get help, what to look out for, who to speak to, how to speak about these things. So I'd really encourage people to look at Beat. And also, even though GPs don't get the training that they need on this kind of issue, there's still a great place to start off to try and talk about mental health and eating disorders in particular as well.
Absolutely. If people want to just Google the word BEAT or type in BEAT eating disorder, it's the first website that comes up, the UK's national eating disorder charity. Thomas, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you sort of sharing your journey. Ed, what a brilliant ambassador you've got both for your services as well, but just in terms of someone who can talk about the issue and really sort of offer a fresh perspective. I think there'll be people listening to this now, Ed, who've never heard, eating disorder spoken about from a male point of view before.
Yeah, absolutely. I think hearing from people's lived experiences is a really empowering experience, and it's also really important to know what it can be like, and also to hear from people that are that further on in the journey and have been there and been through it, but then have also come out the other side and have been able to use their fresher perspective to look back and see what it was really like.
I was going to ask you, Ed, what can we do next? Thomas has given us such a great sort of set of sort of policy steps, though. I think, yeah, absolutely. With the gym inductions, obviously the parity of esteem, almost that you could offer within schools from a gendered point of view as well. What are those steps for you, do you think?
So definitely, it's looking at all the places where those early warning signs are currently being missed. And I think because often so much when it comes to male mental health, it's all the messaging is men need to talk, but what we really need is people to listen. So I think, as Thomas said, it's encouraging people to bite the bullet and not fear those conversations and those early conversations, and just checking in on how people are. I think if you take out the concern about somebody's mental health, it's the kind of conversations you're having every day, but actually it's really engaging in those and actually, rather than just saying, oh, you're right, and not really wanting to listen to the answer, it's having those proper conversations and checking in, and then just keep coming back to it. So it's encouraging families and friends to be more open about struggles, and particularly at times when somebody's going through a transition point, because that can be often a big risk factor. So whether that's some kind of change in their life, whether it's schooling, going to university, like a relationship breakdown, those can often be those times when somebody will use their relationship with food as a way of coping with those feelings. Yeah, it's having those conversations, but then also access to treatment is then the biggest barrier at the moment as well.
Yeah, can I ask you about that? So, between April 2020 and March 2021, Beat delivered 9,999 sessions to men. The year before, it was less than 5,000. So that number has doubled as well. I just wanted to sort of end by asking you about sort of where this trend, or where these numbers, it's a trend, but we're talking about human beings here, where these numbers might go as we come out of this sort of pandemic world, and whether or not that might actually almost reset some of the trends that we've seen, and hopefully allow people opportunity to come forward now.
Yeah, so I think with the pandemic, at times you were seeing 3 times the number of people that we were seeing on previous years using our services, which is both a great thing that people are reaching out, but also it's a sign of as you say, the problems increasing. And I think the lockdowns have unfortunately had an impact on, it's made it easier for people to hide what's going on because there's less contact with people. So I think we will continue to see this trend increase for the time being, and the NHS is working extremely hard to upscale with the increasing demand, but it will take time for that, and it will need more money going into the system to catch up in what's happened over the last couple of years. So but as I say, we're upscaling our services rapidly to meet the demand that we're seeing, and that there will be people out there that can help if somebody's worried. So don't allow that feeling of I won't get heard to stop you from coming forward.
Absolutely, and a conversation with a GP a conversation with a GP, if you're armed with information that you've read as well on a website like Beats as well, might be helpful in terms of making that happen as well. Ed, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you joining us on the program and sort of exploring what you've gone through as well. Thomas, thank you for your time too. Wish you all the best in terms of your ongoing experiences as well. And I look forward to hearing about your various policies being introduced by subsequent governments or not. You could go into politics, actually. I think there's certainly a career in there for you. I thank you both for your time. Really appreciate it. We'll point people in the direction of the Beat website. The easiest thing to do is literally to Google it. It's the first thing that comes up. It's just type in Beat or type in Beat Eating Disorders and click on the first thing that's there. Loads of information and resources that are online. Ed, Thomas, thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.